you all very much for coming. So today's CSEP talk is what's wrong with modern economics. After the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of economists have questioned the ways in which we've done in conducting economists, not only in the field but also beyond it. And it's a subject of lots of argument, lots of contention, and hopefully out of it, some introspection. Today we're very fortunate to have Professor Tony Lawson. He runs the Cambridge Realist Workshop, which is all a part of the Cambridge Ontology Group at Cambridge, unsurprisingly. He's also the senior treasurer of the Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism. In that position, he's in a great place to talk about this question of what's wrong with modern economics. If you've all got pamphlets, I think the structure of this will have about 40 minutes for Professor Lawson to speak. After that point, we'll have questions and a general discussion among students and the like. So without further ado,
thank you. Does everyone have a handout? Yeah, well, there's spare copies. I have spare copies. It's not vital, it's quotes that saves me putting them up there and reading them. You can read them by yourselves. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. A pleasure to see the Pluralist Society flourishing. A pleasure to see so many of you here. It's even a pleasure to see so many faces I teach mathematics to here. And I even see a research student of mine here. So it's a pleasure to see you all. I'm very happy students are organising to rethink the nature of economics, and for reasons I'll give en route, I think pluralism is the right banner to go forward under. I also think the question I've been given is the right question. What is wrong with economics? It involves aspects like, how did we get here? How did it get so bad? What is the nature of the problem? And of course, how do we solve it? It's the right question for many reasons, not least because it's just so rarely addressed. I mean, it's not addressed by the mainstream, who don't really accept there is anything wrong with economics, but it's widely accepted outside the mainstream, even by the Queen. But heterodox economists, though recognising there's a problem with economics and rethinking economics groups, student groups, acknowledge there's something wrong with economics, by and large don't pursue the question, what's wrong with it? What's the nature of the problem? How did the problem arise? Rather, the standard response is to have speakers or conferences, papers, whatever, that propose alternatives. People come along and say, this is the right way to do it. And by implication, the analysis of what is wrong is some theory other than the one that's being defended, or some model other than the one that's being proposed. Or, perhaps more typically, the problem is given a label. The most common label is neoclassical. The opponent is dismissed as something called neoclassical, and just as hopelessly, I think, the person giving the talk describes himself as heterodox, Keynesian, institutionalist, Marxist, feminist, whatever, as if these labels speak for themselves. I personally don't think there is such a thing as neoclassical economics. I think the whole idea of neoclassical as a school of thought is incoherent. But whether or not that's true, it's bandied about as a label, and you have examples of person X dismissing person Y as neoclassical, person Y dismissing person Z as neoclassical, and so on. And all we get is an alternative theory or an alternative policy or model. I think the problems of economics are far deeper than that. And before we can put forward alternatives, we really do have to understand the nature of the problem. Another strategy I think is not very useful is to think that if you've generated a set of results you believe in, that you like, you believe are true, whatever, are emancipatory, that's enough. So if you've got a result you think is true, or a policy you like, perhaps anti-austerity, perhaps pro-austerity, perhaps a result that is emancipatory, like women are oppressed in the workplace or whatever, It's as if that's enough. And making models or whatever consistent with the data, treating data as the truth, and so anything consistent with the data is enough, is not enough. It's not enough because economists are very happy, not only happy, continuously, consistently accept assumptions they know to be false. And if you start from assumptions you know to be false, you can generate anything you want, any truth you want. For example, it may well be true, I believe it to be true, that all polar bears are white. I can get there by saying anything that eats snow is white, polar bears eat snow. Now, I've not helped us understand anything about polar bears, their whiteness, snow, what happens if you eat snow. I've given you nothing, but still I've generated the apparently true claim all polar bears are white, starting from unrealistic assumptions. And that's a problem. It's too easy in economics to say, I don't like your model, here's mine, it's got better conclusions. Yes, the assumptions are unrealistic, but it gets better conclusions. If the assumptions are unrealistic, it's just as bad as other unrealistic assumptions that get different conclusions. It's too easy. If T is true, and I can argue any way I want, I can just assume X implies T and X, and you can generate T, the truth, whatever T is. It's too easy. So we need, the lack of realistic assumptions is part of the problem. It's not part of the solution, it's something we need to explain. Why do economists make assumptions forever that are unrealistic? We also need to explain why the mainstream think there's nothing wrong with the discipline. One other feature or point I want to make before I get on to, so what is the problem, is the problem did not start with the crisis. You've got a handout, the spare copies there. Let me quickly go through some of the quotes on the handout. The popular narrative is given by the first passage from Krugman. It basically says everyone believes economics was fine up until the crisis, economic crisis, and then it all went wrong. That's the popular narrative, so the solution is we just have to find a model that somehow accommodates the crisis or adapts in the light of the crisis, problem solved. The problems didn't start with the crisis. The problems have been there for the last 50, 60, 70 years. What you've got on here is quotes from basically mainstream economists themselves acknowledging the state of the discipline. I start with Lipsey because my understanding is many of you use this textbook at school. He says, quote 2, anomalies, particularly those that cut across the subdisciplines and can be studied with various technical levels of sophistication, are tolerated, he's talking about economics, on a scale that would be impossible in most natural sciences and would be regarded as a scandal if they were. He says more, quote 3, Ariel Rubinstein is talking at the moment when John Nash was given the Nobel Memorial Prize, and he's given a speech in favour of game theory. But the first part of the quote says economics is not a great state, and he ends up with a small sentence at the bottom, economic theory lacks a consensus as to its purpose and interpretation. Again and again we find ourselves asking the question, where does it lead? Next quote by Richard Parker, I won't go through them all, he's a sociologist. He observes from the outside and says, we've all known for years economics is in a mess. He was suggesting in 1993, economists are beginning to realise it themselves. I think it was one of many false dawns. All these quotes you'll see are well before the crisis. The problems of the discipline did not start with the crisis. Getting to quote 5, 6 and 7, these are Nobel Memorial Prize winners, not heterodox critics, people who've won the prize for contributing to the mainstream. Wassily Leontiev says page after page, professional economic journals are filled with mathematical formulas leading the reader from sets of more or less plausible but entirely arbitrary assumptions to precisely stated but irrelevant theoretical conclusions. And so it continues. Over the page, quote 6, Milton Friedman, hardly a radical. Economics has become increasingly an arcane branch of mathematics rather than dealing with real economic problems. Coe says pretty much the same. Existing economics is a theoretical system which floats in the air. etc. These are Nobel Memorial Prize winners. Quote 8, Lima, one of the main or top best-known US econometricians, says econometrics is full of inconsistency. Econometricians divide themselves into what he calls the priests and the sinners. Priests put down the theory, the sinners do something else. There's a total inconsistency between the theory of econometrics and the practice, and he points out the priests and the sinners are also the same people on different days or different parts of the building. Quote 10, Mark Blau spent most of his career trying to defend mainstream economics. He wrote books saying that, kind of a Popperian analysis, saying that econometrics was a way of testing mainstream theories, but in the end he gave up. He says in quote 10, modern economics is sick. Economics has increasingly become an intellectual game played for its own sake and not for its practical consequences, etc. These are all quotes from before the crisis. The problems of the discipline did not start with the economic crisis. So what's the problem? What's the problem with modern economics? As Arnav said, I'm part of the Cambridge Social Ontology Group. I think to understand the problem, to resolve the problems of economics, we need a turn to ontology. Ontology is what I do. What is ontology and why is that relevant? Ontology is the study of nature of being, the nature of stuff. Onto means being, ology means study. So study of being, study the nature of reality. Social ontology, study the nature of society, social material, the nature of things we deal with, nature of money, nature of corporations, nature of gender, markets, technology, the nature of stuff. The usual reaction to that is to say, well, what's that got to do with science? And the answer is everything. Even if you turn to the physical, especially if you turn to the physical sciences, there you see most of the main debates are in ontology, the nature of stuff. Debates between Einstein and Bohr at the beginning of the last century were all about the nature of the fundamental constituents of reality. The nature of quantum fields or just waves, particles. Is the universe probabilistic? What is the nature of everything they deal with? They built an electron accelerator at CERN because they want to test out a theory about a Higgs boson particle at issue is the nature of mass. According to the best theory of particle physics, particles have no mass, and yet we're made of particles, apparently, and we have mass. Actually, we're probably not made of particles, but there are theories that say we are. Physics studies the nature of stuff through and through. And the biggest worry today is they can't work out what most of the stuff is. They call it dark matter and they don't know what it is. They call it dark energy, but they don't know what energy is either. But it's the stuff of debate. In economics, it should be the same. I wonder how many courses in economics, I have no idea what proportion of you are economists, but I wonder how many of you get courses on the nature of money, the nature of markets, the nature of debt, gender, technology, even what is the economy, capitalism. Anyway, this is the stuff of ontology. And we all do it, not just scientists, you did it getting here. You navigated all sorts of objects in order to get here. You entered through the door, not through the wall. You walk through a park, you see something in front of you, you react differently according to whether it's a bush, a bird, a tiger, whatever. You weigh up the nature of whatever is confronting you and you act accordingly. We all do ontology. What's that got to do with my topic today? Well, we do ontology when we use tools. In my pocket, I've got wallet, I've got a pen on me, I've got all sorts of things on me which serve as tools. They're useful for some things and not others. I don't try and keep money inside a pencil. I don't use a pencil to cut the hedge or whatever. So all tools are appropriate for some conditions and not others. And this is where the problem comes. The problem of economics is like using a hammer to cut the grass. It's the wrong tool that's used. The hammer in this case is methods of mathematical modeling, and the grass, of course, is society, social reality. There's a mismatch of tool and its object. Mathematics is a tool, mathematical modelling is a tool just like any other tool, just like a telescope, a microscope, an electron accelerator. They're all tools of analysis. Mathematical models are tools of analysis. Each tool is appropriate for some conditions, not other conditions. As I say, the use of mathematics to do social analysis is a bit like using the hammer to cut the grass. Now I'm going to argue that case, but notice before I do, taking the stance I do, putting forward the claim I do, I am not taking an anti-mathematics stand. I'm not taking an anti-the hammer stand by saying it's no good for cutting the grass. I'm opposing the mismatch of the hammer to the grass. I'm not saying the hammer is something bad, shouldn't be used appropriately. And the same with mathematics. I'm not taking an anti-mathematics stand. I'm saying there's a mismatch between the tool and the object. Excuse me. In fact, I would argue I'm taking a pro-mathematics stand. As it happens, I love mathematics. It is possible to love tools. I suspect there's some people in the room who play musical instruments. Perhaps you play the violin or the guitar. If so, you probably won't be too happy if someone picks up the violin and uses it to hammer a nail into the wall or uses it as a cricket bat. It's the same kind of attitude. To say it's not a good tool for the job is not to oppose the violin or the guitar or whatever. It's to oppose the mismatch. So my claim is there's a mismatch of tool and the nature, the stuff of social reality. So what's the argument? How do I defend that claim? Well, the first question is, when are the methods of mathematical modelling ever useful? Under what conditions? What must social reality be like, or any reality be like, so that the sort of methods economists use are useful? Now, the sorts of mathematical tools economists use presuppose event regularities. Mostly economists deal with functions and calculus. I know, I teach it to you. A presupposition for these methods are correlations. Deterministic, stochastic. Regularity to the form whenever x, then y. When income goes up, consumption goes up by some determinate amount. In order to guarantee event regularities, you requires an ontology of closed systems of isolated atoms. By atoms, I mean not something small, but something that does the same thing each time. Think of a wind-up doll. I wind it up, put it down, it walks forward. Assuming this is a flat table, it walks forward. It has to be isolated, otherwise wind or a passing dog could knock it over there and you couldn't predict where it's going. So to get event regularity, whenever I wind it up, it walks forward. You need something that does the same thing every time and it's isolated from countervailing influences. That's the ontology of modern economics. Of course, it's not wind-up dolls. Typically, you have to make assumptions to turn whatever you're looking at, people, agents, into atoms. The usual assumption is rationality, optimizing. Human beings do nothing but optimize, and then you set them down in a context where, relative to their ability to optimize, there's a unique optimum, and off they go to it. So you can predict what they'll do. You can deduce what you do. You have theorems about what they'll do. That's the ontology of most modern economics. Rationality is just one way of turning human beings into atoms. You can make them follow fixed rules. There's all sorts of setups that will achieve the same, but that's what you have to achieve. This ontology, world of isolated atoms. Now my claim is social reality is not at all like that. It's not a world of isolated atoms. Unfortunately, I haven't got much time, and I know Arnav wants me to be as quick or short as possible, so I can't defend the conception of reality that I do defend. That is, I can't argue the case. I'm more or less going to assert it, but I want to give you a feel for it and why, if I'm right, it's no wonder economic models don't work. First thing I want to say about social reality, well, first of all, the social realm is that realm of phenomena that depends on us for its existence. Anything that wouldn't be here, we weren't here. So it includes tables, chairs, languages, pollution, social relations, the economy, everything that depends on us. That social reality, first of all, is structured. By that I mean there are different levels of reality. If you take our driving practices on motorways, we know there's a maximum speed limit, and yet just about everyone drives above it until we see a camera or a police car, and we all slow down. We all know the rules really, and we all know there's a time when we have to be seen to be following the rules. So there's two elements there of that picture. There's the practices, driving, and there's the rules. But the practices don't always conform to the rules. They do under certain conditions. But there's an ontological distinction between the rule itself and the practice. Social reality is structured. We all have practices. We're following them now. We're following the practices of a lecture. It's structured by all sorts of rules, amongst other things. This structure matters. It means we can go from practices we're interested in to the underlying structure that conditions it. Rules, social relations, positions, and all sorts of other things. That move, if I had more time, I would argue, is the essence of science. Going from phenomena that's puzzling at one level to the structural, the causal conditions. It's not about correlation. It's not about prediction. That's a specific case of causal analysis. Science more generally is causal analysis. Cows wobble their heads and fall over. We try to work out what's wrong, what causes mad cow's disease. The cause, it turns out, is a protein that changes shape, the prion. We go from falling leaves to gravity. We go from phenomena at one level to the underlying causal condition explaining it. So in the social realm, we can go from practices we're interested in, bound up, if you like, with crises or poverty or oppression or whatever we're interested in, to their structural conditions and seek to transform them. That move we can make in the social realm as they do in physics and chemistry. So nothing I'm saying is undermining the possibility of economics as science, but I am suggesting science isn't about correlation and prediction. It's about causal analysis. Sociality then is structured, but it's not just structured, it's also highly internally related. Everything's related to everything else. And that's fundamental to the construction of social reality. We now form a community, and we're related to each other. I'm following a different practice than you are. I'm following the typical practice of someone who gives a lecture or a seminar. I'm going to speak for a while, you sit quietly, then it's your turn, you lay into me, and I'll have to try and reply. To make sense of this, you have to see reality structured by positions with associated rights and obligations. I'm in the position now of seminar giver. The quantitative position I'm in, I have various rights and obligations. I have the right to speak. Later I'll have the obligation to answer questions. My rights are matched to your obligations. While I'm speaking, you have an obligation to sit quietly and pretend to look interested and all the rest of it. Then you have the right afterwards to tell me where I've gone wrong, and I have the obligation to reply. He's in a different position altogether. He has even more power. He has the right to say who can speak when, and we have the obligation to respond to him. These matching rights and obligations are social relations. They structure us, they constitute me as a speaker, him as a chairperson, you as participants. And our rights and obligations to be here are matched, or our rights to be here are matched by obligations of others to fund this building, to fund the electricity, to keep it clean, and so on. Social reality is made up of these structures of internal relations that are mutually constitutive, and it's not just people, and it is people, I mean it's people in positions, it's teachers, students, employers, employees, landlords, landladies, tenants, parents, children, but also, especially under capitalism, the money system, the commodity system, each system, production, finance, the rest of it, they're all internally related to each other. They presuppose each other. They are what they are in virtue of the relationships to the other. The implication why I'm going through all this is one of the assumptions for mathematical modelling methods to work is you have a system of isolated atoms. You can't isolate anything in the social realm. Everything is connected to everything else. It's not just linked to everything else, it's constituted to everything else. I am constituted as a speaker now, only my relationships to you lot. You're constituted as seminar attendees in relation to me. You're constituted as members of this university in relation to others, but you're in a position which is related to other positions. When you leave the university, other people fill your positions. These positions are rights and obligations which relate us all as social beings, are inherent in social reality. So you cannot isolate bits and pieces of social reality as is presumed in the use of mathematical models. It's one of the reasons they don't work. But not only can you not isolate, but social reality is processual. It's not like the fixed atomistic wind-up dial. Everything is in process. Think of language. Language to this point has been an unacknowledged condition of my speaking to you. It's an unacknowledged condition most of the time of anyone who speaks, writes, reads in English. I'm thinking of English now, but it applies to every language, obviously. As I speak to you, as I try to convince you of what I've got to say, I'm drawing on that language. And through my speech acts and through the speech, reading, writing, thinking acts of everyone throughout the planet who does it in English, the language is reproduced. When I come to speak, it's an unacknowledged condition of my speech acts. As a result of everyone speaking and writing in total, it's an unintended outcome. But that's its mode of existence. It doesn't exist any other way. It's just continually reproduced through our practices and transformed. Now, language is one of the most enduring features of social structure. Most other features do not endure. Even language changes, of course. Most of you no doubt have mobiles in your pockets and you text each other, and every time you text you probably transform the language. But what applies to language being in process applies to this society, to this seminar, to the economics department, to the university, this town, the economy, the financial system, your embodied personalities. All of them are reproduced, transformed through practice. Nothing in the social realm corresponds to the fixed dial that just walks forward. Everything is continually being transformed. So social reality, I know this is very quick and I'm mostly asserting it. I'm trying to give you a feel for it. I'm happy to spend hours defending this vision, but social reality does not conform to the preconditions of mathematical modelling. And there's so much I haven't told you about. Social reality contains meaning, it contains value, it contains emergent totalities I've kind of hinted at, but that has all sorts of implications. So it's not the sort of stuff that allows the mathematical modelling project to get to be very successful. Now you may think, all this talk about rights, obligations, this is sociology, it's not economics. Even if that were true, it would still undermine all this emphasis on mathematical modelling. But actually the most fundamental features in economics fit this ontology. I haven't got time to go very far, so let me just consider one. Money. What is money? Money is government debt, backed up by pieces of paper we call cash or whatever, but it's government debt. What is a debt? It's an obligation, and that obligation only exists if someone has a right over the government, the person who holds the cash or whatever. It's just a particular example of right-obligation relationship, just like the ones that hold between us and make us members of this seminar. The nature of the obligations, given the power of the government, is such that whoever holds money has the right to go to the marketplace, enter another debt relationship with the person they're buying things from and cancel that debt using government debt. It's all about exchanging rights and obligations. The stuff I'm talking about is not peripheral or outside of economics. It is at the heart of the economy. It should be at the heart of economics. A corporation, just quickly, when is a firm a corporation? It's a firm that's positioned as a human being. It's in a position called a legalized person. It's a firm that has rights and obligations, so it can own property. Unincorporated firms can't do that. Don't have legal person status. This ontology fits everything in the social realm. It's not just the material for sociologists and people who study politics to look at. Indeed, once you take this ontology seriously, in fact, there's no real non-arbitrary basis for dividing economics from sociology, from politics, from anthropology. Anyway, we all become social science, but that's another story. Okay, I've suggested to you an explanation of the state of modern economics. It's like using the hammer to cut the grass. It's trying to use mathematical modelling to analyse social reality. Mathematical models presuppose a world of isolated atoms. Social reality is a highly internally connected world that's in process, a different world than that presupposed by methods of mathematical modelling. From this, we can see why mathematical modelling goes wrong in all branches of economics, micro and macro econometrics, why it has done for the last 50, 60 years, because that's the period in which mathematical models have been dominant. We can see why mathematical models can't explain. We can also see why the assumptions are all unrealistic, because the assumptions are all about turning a world that's open in process into one that's closed and atomistic and isolated. It's by making the real ontology fit our models, we're necessarily distorting it. We're having to be unrealistic. So it's not surprising that every time we put forward a mathematical model, we make unrealistic assumptions. And it's not good enough to come along with a different set of unrealistic assumptions and say, I get better results than you. It's the same problem. Okay, the theory I've put forward, I think, is very simple. I've been putting it forward for quite a long time, and I have to say quite honestly, I've never seen anyone argue against it, or not very successfully. So the question is why? Why don't mathematical modelers take any notice? Why does the discipline continue the way it has done for so long? Why is it still doing it? And I think the answer is important, especially for you, this group. It's not that mathematical modelers are bad people, nasty people, dishonest people. I don't think they're conspiratorial people who want to pull the wool over your eyes. I think you have to see their orientation to mathematical modelling as a methodological ideology. By ideology, I don't mean conspiracy. I mean something that's so commonsensical that you don't question it, and that anyone who does question it must be an idiot or an extremist or a terrorist or something, but you give them a name and you ignore them. It's not something you treat seriously. Oh, that reminds me, the last quote on this handout I gave you. So what I'm saying really corresponds to what Alfred North Whitehead, a Cambridge philosopher, the last century said. He said, when you're criticizing the philosophy of an epoch, do not chiefly direct your attention to those intellectual positions which its opponents feel it necessary explicitly to defend. There'll be some fundamental assumptions which adherents of all the various systems within the epoch unconsciously presuppose. Such assumptions appear so obvious that people do not know what they are assuming because no other way of putting things has ever occurred to them, etc. Well, other ways have been put to them, but it's still, they so see the mathematical approach as common sense that they don't really listen to the criticism. They've been criticised from all angles within heterodoxy, from feminists and Marxists and Austrians and institutionalists and post-Keynesians. Whatever direction it comes from, it's kind of ignored. And that brings me to pluralism, because I think pluralism is the right message. Because pluralism isn't saying you're wrong. Pluralism is saying all voices ought to be listened to. The discipline ought to open itself up to engagement, tolerance, interaction with each other. Let different views be heard and let there be criteria for people to choose between them. And that's a message I don't think anyone can oppose. I mean, mainstream people might think it's unnecessary, but it's still not something that they ought to feel threatened by. And clearly the message has been heard. The pluralists throughout the country have been acknowledged everywhere, and including the university authorities here are putting pressure on the economics faculty to change courses. I mean, the people in my faculty don't really want to change courses, or certainly not the content. They don't mind changing title, but not the content. But it's a start. I think pluralism is the right strategy. Having said that, perhaps I'm coming to the end. Coming to the end, be a little bit critical, well, not critical, sound a critical note towards pluralism itself. First thing I'd like to say, pluralism can't mean, or it's not very useful if it means anything goes. I take it pluralism means open to others, engagement with others, tolerance of others, inclusion of others, allowing everything, all tools in the toolbox, being respectful to others, charitable to opponents, but not that every theory is good as every other theory. I mean, if I say if you wiggle your ears, you can fly home, that theory is not a very good theory, and you don't have to give it the sort of credibility you might give to someone who says the opposite. A critical orientation is not in opposition to pluralism. It means dealing with everything respectfully and critically and engaging it. Another thing I would say is, in pluralism, broaden the pluralism to include as much as possible. And remember, I started off by talking about most people responded to the crisis in economics by putting forward new theories, new policies, new models. Missing is philosophical discussion. Now, I know I'm here and I'm very happy to be invited to talk to you, but it's quite rare. If you look at the agenda for Rethinking Economics conferences, philosophical analyses aren't there very often, and if they are, they're certainly never keynote speeches. They're usually tagged on somewhere at the slot at 9 o'clock in the morning and coupled with history of thought or whatever. It's as though it's not really important. I want to suggest to you it's fundamental. In fact, all the problems of the discipline are basically ontological. The orientation of the discipline ought to be ontological, as it is in physics and chemistry and biology and almost everything else. There is so much in the social realm to study, and almost none of it gets studied. And I am talking about things like money and markets and the rest of it. So I put in a plea to include philosophy in this pluralist orientation. And I would also put a request that within philosophy, you don't restrict it to methodology or methods, as I know people want to. The problem of economics is its method, but that doesn't mean the solution is another method. When you look to the physical realm, they don't really start with methods, they start with ontology. They start with whatever they're interested in. If they want to look at a planet a long way away, they build a telescope or a spacecraft to go there. If they want to check a theory about the nature of mass, and they need to check out the Higgs boson theory, they build an electron accelerator. If they want to look at something small, they build a microscope. It's no point starting with methods first. I mean, it's useful to know methods, to have a bit of maths, bit of stats, bit of this, bit of that. But the point is, most problem solving occurs on the job. We need to know the nature of what we're dealing with. What is the nature of globalization, of the corporation, of gender, of exploitation, or of poverty? In looking at the question, we can adapt methods, approaches to it. What's missing, what's truly lacking, is ontology. And it's too important to be lumped with history of thought, important though history of thought is. Okay, that's basically the talk. I can see I've gone over time. Let me summarize what I think I've said, or what I've said. My starting point is not a priori. I haven't started with any axioms. It's empirical. I start from the observation that economics is in a mess. It's not a healthy state. It applies to micro, macro, econometrics, all fields before and after the crisis. It applies as much to behavioural neurological economics as it does to anything else, and it goes back way before the crisis. That's the starting point. I observe that people don't really ask the question what's wrong with economics, they just come along with solutions. My belief is that most solutions aren't solutions at all, they're part of the problem, that we need to understand the problem. The problem, I believe, is very simple. It's using the hammer to cut the grass. It's using a tool that's not appropriate to the subject matter. It's using mathematical modelling in conditions for which it's not appropriate. This is not an anti-math stance. I wish maths was more useful. I love maths. It's an anti-mismatch of tool and its object stance. It's an anti-mismatch stance. It's a very simple explanation. Why don't people accept it more? I think it's for the best reasons. I think people who do mathematical modelling think they're being scientific. I think they've got the wrong image of science, but they're doing it to save the discipline. They believe they're being scientific, they even think they're at the cutting edge, there's even a kind of macho-ness to it. Actually, they're all fuddy-duddies, they're out of touch. The philosophy that underpins it went out of date years ago. I mean, people understood the limitations of positivism, which grounds it a long time ago. However, they don't hear because it's an ideology, it's a common sense. They're so wrapped up in it, they're so convinced it's the only way to go forward that they don't really hear the criticism. So, although people like me have been criticising for years, they haven't a clue that I exist. Pluralism, though, is something different. Pluralism isn't saying you're wrong. Pluralism is saying let's include other things, let's be open, let's be inclusive. And it's working, you've got a chance. So I'm saying, good luck to you. Go forward in the name of pluralism. But in the name of pluralism, you've got a lot to do. You've got to reclaim the real world. You've got to reclaim intellectuality, honesty, inclusiveness. So many things to reclaim, but my hope, my belief is that you ought to include in that list somewhere, hopefully near the beginning or at the end, a turn to ontology. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor Lawson. I think it's evident why he's the senior treasurer of our Society for Economic Pluralism. Now, just very quickly, I see some people are having to sit on the ground. If the space is in between, if people can shuffle in, that'd be fantastic. Just so they can find a seat. And for the questions, we've got a good kind of 20-30 minutes we can do for opening up the questions. Please try to keep them brief. They go on, and unfortunately, we're going to have to cut you off just so we can get everyone in and have those slots here. So, we'll start with this.
Hello, I'm Harry from the Reorienting Economics group at UCL. I have a question for you. This is, we sitting in this room, and we in this group might know to a larger or less extent what's wrong with economics. And in fact, we and I have had a lot of talks and seminars and discussion on exactly this topic. We know that the assumptions are not right, they're not realistic. Their methods are wrongly using mathematical models to model social reality. Their methodology is wrong. They neglect social, political, and historical realities, and they neglect the fact that human systems are open systems. So we know all of these, but I want to ask a more practical question. Why do you think that is the case? You touched briefly on this. You said that is because ideology, but I mean, the econ profession, they supposedly like consist of people who are very important and very smart. So I mean, is it exactly just because of ideology? And if that's the case, how can we like make it like better again? I mean, before I came to study economics, I just basically thought that economics is the study of the real economy. And I think that if everyone adopted that sort of definition, I think we wouldn't have any problem. And that to me is just a very common sense definition. Why is this so much?
Oh, there's a lot there. Okay. I do want to stress, when I say ideology, there are hundreds of varieties of ideology. I'm not emphasizing the conspiratorial approach. I mean, I wasn't there, but I imagine when someone first said the Earth is not flat, people thought that that was pretty stupid. When Copernicus said the Earth was not the center of the universe, he died pretty much as soon as he said it, but his followers were not popular. Darwin, when he said we're all related to all other creatures on the planet, was not popular. It was much made fun of. Anything that goes against the common sense of the time is problematic. When I say ideology, I just mean the ruling, pervading common sense. You know. So, I mean, nothing negative, but still, your question is, how did it arise? How did we get here, at least? I take that as your question. Long story. The short answer is read chapter 10 of Reorienting Economics, but let me summarize. Economics didn't become mathematical overnight. 200 years ago, Newton united heaven and earth with equations, and Kant said we need a social scientific Newton, and off everyone went trying to mathematize social reality, especially in France with the physiocrats. And they tried right up until just after the Second World War, including Valras. They weren't successful. They mostly laughed out of court. There was all sorts of things going on. But the environment was hostile. Then something changed, and it wasn't economic successes. After the Second World War, at a time when American ascendancy, in so many ways, but imperialism in the academic world in particular, they had in America the McCarthyite witch hunts. And money going to academic departments went to those that were perceived as non-troublemakers. All economists were perceived as troublemakers pretty much because they criticised the capitalist system. But there was a group, especially at the Cowes Commission, made up of mathematical modelers, especially people like De Breuer, who come from the Bourbaki school, said, look, our models have got no necessary interpretation. They're pure maths. You can interpret them any way you want. We just, y is a function of x1 to xn, no necessary interpretation for the variables. We just do maths. They got the money, they got control. Everyone wanted to be their friend because that was a way to prove you weren't a communist and go to prison, or at least to survive as a university department. That's a snippet of a very long chapter. What I'm really saying is it's the environment that selected out different approaches. There are people trying to mathematize, people doing other things, and the environment's gone this way and that way. After the war, the environment switched so that those doing modeling got the rewards. Also, the United States was full up of game theorists and others who had fled Nazi persecution. They'd all kind of congregated there. They got funded at that time. Once they got control, when you get control of a discipline and you've got no explanatory successes, you become defensive, you become insecure. So you shore up the promotion procedures, you shore up the job appointment procedures. It doesn't happen in a discipline that's full of confidence like physics and chemistry and biology. They're open to all new ideas. Economics isn't. It's that kind of story. Have I answered everything?
So basically, is that just the yearning for economics to be more like science? Right?
Well, it's a misconception of science, but yet they want to be scientists. I mean, trouble is, this topic and my answer to the question touches on everything, really everything, from quantum fields up to social relationships in time and everything that exists now. But part of the problem is a misconception of science. Probably most people, probably a lot of people in this room think science is necessarily tied to mathematics, that science is all about correlation and prediction. And if that's your conception of science, and you desperately believe economics can be a science, off you go trying to do it with your mathematical modelling. As I see it, once you recognise science is actually about going from phenomenal level to underlying causes, we don't need math. Not only do we not need maths, maths can't do that because you're going from one type of thing. It's important to recognise that. Causal analysis, you're going from one type of thing to a different thing. Cows wobbling their heads to a prion. For that you need luck, ingenuity, metaphor, creativity. You can't reason that way from one thing to something new using maths. Maths can do induction and deduction. You see a lot of debates amongst mainstream economists. I'm really, I'm cutting edge. I use induction. You're stuck with deduction. It's the same problem. Take polar bears. I said all polar bears are white. If I see 6 polar bears and I say therefore all polar bears are white, I'm using induction. If I start from the assumption all polar bears are white, then I deduce the next one to walk through that door will be white. But if I'm doing causal analysis, I start from the whiteness of polar bears and ask the question, why are all polar bears white? What's the mechanism that made them white? It's something intrinsic to them as an environmental selection mechanism, but it's going from whiteness of polar bears to something different which causes the whiteness. That's retroduction. It's a different type of inference. That, I think, is essential to science, but economists are stuck in, I think, a mistaken view that science is about correlation, prediction, and so mathematics.
So what exactly would be the alternative to mathematical modeling? I mean, if you think about the question, should we adopt the minimum wage? So with mathematical modeling or with regression, you could look at data from different countries and look how typically minimum wage has affected unemployment, for example. I mean, with logical thinking, I could give you arguments for both sides. And so what exactly would you suggest as a method?
Well, I'm certainly not proposing an alternative to logical thinking. Logical thinking doesn't reduce to deductive mathematical logic. Dialectics, for example, is a form of logic, modal logic, just talking. I hope I'm using logic. The example you give, although I'd rather talk more generally, the example you give of minimum wage, I mean, in the US, they've been put it into some states and not into others next door to it, so you can look at the difference if you want to make the assumption that the conditions are the same throughout. Now, you can put mathematical methods to that, but you certainly don't need to do mathematical methods to that. But that example is actually an example of a more general case. I would say that a general approach, but part of what I'm saying is we don't want to replace one set of methods by another fixed set of methods. All depends on the context of what we're looking at. But still, one approach that does seem to generalize everything else is dialectics. Now, I worry saying that word because, one, it frightens people and it means it's so many different things, to the Ionian Greeks, to the later Greeks, to Hegel, to whoever. Let me give an example. Something called contrast explanation. In contrast explanation, the goal is not to explain some outcome, y, but why x rather than y in conditions where you expected them to be the same. So if you're a farmer, you've got a crop and the yield is twice as high at one end of the field. What explains the difference? Now, why is that useful? Because although you can't have yield as a function of x1 to xn when you don't know x1 to xn, if you're looking at that field, you're trying to standardize for everything except the one factor that makes a difference. You don't know how much rain or sunlight will come in a particular growing period, but you've got reason to think that throughout the field, the rainfall is the same. Throughout the field, the sun is the same. Throughout the field, you hope the soil composition is the same. Throughout the field, the insect life is the same. That although you don't know what all the causal factors are, you're standardizing for everything except the one that makes a difference. It could be a passing river, it could be shade from the trees. You've got two hypotheses there, so you've got to distinguish. Maybe in the next field, the stream goes through the middle of the field and the trees go around the side. Is the crop higher along the side or by the river? You might be able to discriminate. That's the sort of question you can address. Now, the starting point is to ask what explains x rather than y in conditions where you're surprised. You have to be surprised. I could come in here and say, this is a different colour to the colour of my house. There's nothing to explain. It's not a surprise. Unless, of course, I own this building and I instructed someone to paint it a different colour, then I might be surprised. So we start from a situation, a contrast space, where we don't know much, but we expect things to be the same, and they're different. You may not know much about your body, but you wake up in the morning, you've got a massive headache. You don't normally. What makes a difference? Oh yeah, I drank a bottle of whiskey last night, or whatever. you can identify what makes the difference. You don't have to know everything about yourself, you just need to know what makes a difference. So start from an area where you expect things to be the same. In Cambridge, house prices used to go up roughly the same rate. Didn't know much about what caused house prices to go up differently, except that one part of town they started to go up faster. It became clear they just electrified the train line to London, and it became quicker to, if you worked in London, to live in Cambridge than to commute from the outskirts of London. So people were all moving to that side of Cambridge. Start with a space where you expect things to be the same. Look for where things are different and you're surprised by it, and you've got a chance of identifying the factor that makes a difference. Why do I say that's dialectics? By dialectics, very, very quickly, I mean start with an understanding, and then whatever you're understanding, a contradiction starts the explanatory exercise. You expect the crop yield to be the same, it's higher. You expect to feel the same when you wake up, you feel terrible. Start from the contradiction, explain the contradiction. Then you have a new level of understanding. Then you look for more contradictions, and so on. And you can apply that to open and closed system. It turns out that closed system analysis in the experiment is just a special case. But I'll leave it there. Sorry, it's you asked the question.
Accepting your argument for rejecting math as a model, but accepting ontology into economic thinking, how do you relate to a claim put forward by Hélène Badiou, who says that math is ontology? And why do you maintain the division between natural and social realm? It seems to me that basically we can extend what you're saying about the social ontology and basically drop the social, because every ontology is social in that sense. Like what it had in mind?
I hope I didn't, but this has been videoed, so you can play it back and listen to me. I hope I've been saying social and non-social realm, or economics and physics and chemistry, but you're right, it's all a natural realm. I don't distinguish. Certainly economic social theory is part of the natural realm. I'm a naturalist. My own interest is how do we get from quantum fields to social relations. It's all part of the natural world. I mean, you don't have to be a naturalist, you can be a dualist. I'm not one. And you don't have to ask the question, how do we get from quantum fields to social relations? The Amerindians think people came first and that stones and rocks are degenerate human beings, so they get shaman to communicate, so they go the other way around. So there's no necessity in ontology to go one way, the other way, or any way. But I do, as it happens. So I agree with you, the social is part of the natural. Everything is part of ontology, ultimately. You're right. I mean, ontology is study of being. What isn't part of being? Mathematics included. And there is a question. In fact, funny enough, I had a seminar 2 days ago at the Realist Workshop. The whole question was what's basically the ontology of mathematics? Are operators, plus, minus, divide, multiply, are they objects? What is their nature? What are their properties? So I think I'm agreeing with your question. When you say, why don't I agree with you, I do.
Regarding math is ontology? Simply equating math as ontology?
Well, everything is ontology, so the sense in which it is, yes. So if everything's part of ontology, the question that follows from that is, well, how do you focus on anything? And then the emphasis is to focus on things qua being. Although everything's part of ontology, because it's part of being, there's a sense in which looking at something as a type of being as opposed to, say, what's happening to it today. So it's a different question to ask, what is the nature of money? It's a different question to asking, what happens if we increase the money supply by 2% tomorrow? That's less ontological in the sense I'm trying to defend.
So there's sort of a narrative that says in hindsight, it was essentially in the 1930s when national accounting began that kind of opened the sort of floodgates in terms of allowing economics to become more of a, I guess, kind of approach that level of being a science and allowed maths to really take hold. I mean, do you think that now that we've kind of crossed that line and we're still being fed statistics like unemployment rates and GDP growth, etc., that there's ever any any chance that we'll ever escape mathematics within economics as a discipline?
I don't know. I mean, in part, I am bending the stick the other way. I'm really not saying that we must chuck out mathematics, even the name of pluralism, it should be in the toolbox. I'm not saying either that there's no conditions for which mathematics is not useful for social analysis. What I am wanting to say is that mathematics should not be prioritised in the way it is. I mean, currently, the heavy emphasis, economists almost insist mathematics is the only way to look at anything, to analyse anything. I think in the non-social sciences, I nearly said natural there, in physics, chemistry, when people carry out studies and they build experiments or machines or technology to study something, they justify their procedures, and I think we should do more in economics too. If we have a situation where we think mathematics is going to be useful, some kind of justification of what we're doing, you know, why we think joint normality is a reasonable assumption or whatever. I've said mathematical methods economists currently use, and of course there's more to maths than the methods economists currently use, but the sort of methods economists currently use presuppose closed systems of isolated atoms. So the first question is there anywhere in the social realm where these sort of systems seem to hold, approximately? I mean, one example is rush hour traffic. Most city centres in the rush hour, you know, you really got not a lot of choice. You're in your car and you just wait for the car in front of you to go forward, and you go forward too. You can model that. Demand for heating energy, electricity in cold countries in the middle of winter is pretty predictable. You have the heating on and you die pretty much. So where you're forced into this sort of deterministic, atomistic behaviour and there's nothing going to countervail against it, mathematical models can be useful. So I'm not saying to rule them out, and I'm not saying all numbers are irrelevant, all counting, or measurability. However, we are cavalier in economics. You know, we measure anything, and once we've measured it, we think that it's somehow the truth or the ultimate criterion, you know, fitting it, being consistent with it. You know, even to the point now we're measuring happiness, which to me is kind of bizarre. But most of our measures of output, GDP, investment, income, inflation, they're suspect. They should be continually subject to scrutiny. So I'm not for the extreme, let's chuck it all out, but I'm certainly against the present extreme, which is accepted all the data is God and mathematical methods consistent with it, or all we need.
Is there any questions from the left-hand side of the room? But,
well, I'm from the natural sciences, and we use, I mean, mathematics is not all about determinism. We also have statistical models, and obviously when you, I mean, we see behavior of human is statistical because we see some regularities, not if we look at an individual, but if we look at the whole thing. And but when I do physical models, then everything always stays the same, whereas in economics, I guess an individual might have a bigger influence on the stability of the statistics, so it can change, but isn't that like the only basic difference? I mean,
I think it's not, but again, I do not want to oppose anything a priori, including mathematical modelling. So if it's the case that you see forms of human behaviour that seem to conform, then by all accounts, model it mathematically, if you can. Statistical modelling is just a kind of, most event regularities are produced in, say, a well-controlled experiment, conform to a statistical model. I mean, everything changes in the experiment. Every measurement changes, the measuring instrument changes, everything changes, so ultimately it's all statistical. But no, the behaviour of groups of human beings in social life It's mostly organised, and so it's emergent behaviour, it's not aggregate behaviour. It's not like particles where, you know, you can take the average or the aggregate behaviour and you can have laws about the average. You know, in this room, I'm acting differently to you lot who are acting differently to him. We're organised by social relations. This building is a totality. The glass is doing different stuff to the bricks, to the door. They're organised. You can't just add them up or say that each one of them is doing the average job. They're doing different jobs, and so are human beings in society. Part of the problem of economics is they only see only micro or macro. And macro basically is thought to be the aggregate of micro. It's a long, long story, but where the ontology leads to is we need individual and structure analysis and totalities. Human beings are components of communities, totalities, and they organise these communities by rights and obligations, positions, social relations. And how we're organised, the nature of the organisation, we change from, I mean, here you're in one organisation, in a minute you'll probably be in a college dining room or in a pub or somewhere with a totally different organisation, and behaviour changes accordingly. So it doesn't fit in the same sense, or at least it doesn't most of the time. Sometimes it may. I mean, illnesses, contagions of illnesses across people can be modelled mathematically. But there again, there's not a lot of human structure involved there. It's really the bugs that are doing most of the action. And all we're doing is coming into contact with each other. But again, I come back to my first point. If you're right, or where you're right, and there may be instances where you're right, let's go for it. I'm not opposed to mathematics or prediction where the conditions prove to be appropriate. I'm starting from the failure of economics for the last 50, 60 years and giving an explanation.
Wonderful. I think we have time for probably 2 more questions, after which people can come down and ask separately.
My question would be more about strategy, because I would agree with your assessment about the need for more pluralism, but how do we get there? Especially given that, as you pointed out, economics developed this way in part because the US, for instance, funded a certain form of armless type of economics. And so how do we get to have some pluralism? And I think there is probably a fight to have there in some ways, because it's a matter of power ultimately.
Well, again, 2 parts to the question. I mean, students throughout the world are doing good at putting pluralism forward. There's an international network, as far as I can see. It seems to be quite impressive, and it's having an effect everywhere. And there's people from London group here, and I've been invited to talk to different groups up and down the country, and it's happening. I mean, so and so being organised is there. But the question, I'm not sure it's your question, but then what do you do with it? You know, what's the best way forward? I'm very much wanting to emphasise keeping everything open. I think already a lot of mistakes have been made in the name of pluralism. One is to set up a bunch of experts to go and write alternative textbooks, but ever asking what's wrong with economics. And so, as far as I can see, the textbooks are no better than what we already had. George Soros has put millions, hundreds of millions of pounds into his INET to try and make economics more relevant. But again, never asking the question, what's the problem with economics? And it's full up with people. We have an INET group in Cambridge. As far as I can see, it's just the same project. Mathematical modelling under the name of Keynes or something with the same problems. So rather than having experts deciding for us and claiming to be different because they change a model assumption, you know, we're relaxing the assumptions of standard model, whatever, openness, criticalness, openness all the way. Question everything, engage everything, try everything in as critical a fashion as possible. I do believe, and I think one of the first questions was, how can so many clever people get it so wrong? A premise behind that question is everyone's clever, everyone's evolved, and I go with that. I just see blinkers. Blinkers is the problem, not nastiness, not conspiracy, not neoliberalism, not a desire to fashion the world this way or that, just blinkers. And the real question is how to get rid of the blinkers. Once the blinkers are removed, I think human ingenuity, if unconstrained, will emancipate the discipline, but the question is how to get rid of the blinkers. There, I think pluralism is the right banner. How to get more people pushing for pluralism, I don't know, but you seem to be doing quite well. So I'll leave that to you.
One last question over there.
I'm sorry, I'm giving long answers.
To what extent then do you think that the search for correlation, as opposed to contrast, is about a quest for control? And if that is the case, how do we bring about a change where contrast is more accepted rather than simply looking for correlation?
Control. Well, I'm going to interpret your question, but it might not be the interpretation you meant. But you're right. This brings us on to policy and ethics and all sorts of things that I haven't had chance to talk about. I mean, ontology, as you kind of applied in mathematics, pervades everything. The things I'm talking about tonight, there isn't a sphere they don't have implications for, and one of them is ethics and the rest of it. With the mathematical approach, policy is created using equations. Y is a function of x1 to xn. Basically, some of these variables are considered endogenous, others exogenous. And the idea is to control the exogenous ones, interest rates, tax rates, whatever, and so predict, control the future. In that sense, it's about control. Models tweak the things we got control over in order to determine, they think, the future, except it doesn't happen. Once you set the orientation I'm defending, it's a long, long story, it's very, very different. Instead of control, it's about emancipation. Instead of equations that don't exist to try and predict, control the future, the goal is to see the structures that condition human interaction and identify those we don't want, those that facilitate the oppression of women by men or immigrant by indigenous or whatever, structures that facilitate or encourage or give rise to poverty, whatever we don't want. Identify the structures that stand in the way of human flourishing and then find ways to transform them, to liberate whoever is oppressed before you get rid of, transform the structure. But after that, what they do, you can't predict. People will choose. So it's a different approach. But of course, there's lots of presuppositions here. In order to remove structures, you have to know what human beings are, human nature. And that's ontology again. Who are we? What is human nature? Are we all the same? I mean, there's so many different genders now, or people of different sexes or sexual orientations. How different are we? Are old the same as young? Are people in this group the same as people in that group? We're all different. So the question is, given, well, first of all, is there a human nature? Then is there a common human nature? What's different? Are we all, how unique are we all? What sort of society can facilitate our flourishing in our differences? They're all ontological questions, and the path then becomes removal, identification, removal of structures that get in the way of flourishing. So instead of prediction and control, it's structural transformation and emancipation. But that, I understand, is such a quick answer to such a big topic, and you'll probably tell me when you said control, you meant something completely different anyway.
A bit like prediction, don't they?
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Lawson. Just before you head off, the last few points. Some of you may see pamphlets and kind of questionnaires. Unfortunately, we're not able to print off, not for everyone, but essentially, if you'd like to leave your email address particularly, I'm present, I send the emails, I try to keep them brief and to the point. If I don't, tell me. But if you haven't got a pamphlet and would like to sign up, please put your name down here. We have our Facebook page, we have this video, this event, as well as all our other events we're putting up there. So if you like that and follow that, you can see more about that. We've also got our event next week on Corbonomics on the 20th, which is a Friday. It should be really interesting and topical, as well as a Paper Zero talk on gender and feminist critiques of the mainstream. And finally, one last round of applause.